You think silence means the story is over. It doesn't. Sometimes silence is where the real story begins. Because when a deeply loving person stops explaining, stops chasing, stops trying to hold everything together alone, the room does not become empty. It becomes honest. And that honesty hits hard. Especially the one who kept running from closeness, hiding behind distance, acting calm, while their inner world stayed unsettled. Here is the part most people miss. The one who pulls away can look fine at first, cold, unbothered, in control. But when the warmth they depended on quietly disappears, something shifts under the surface. Slowly, then all at once, the messages stop. The emotional rescue stops. The soft place they used to land on is gone. And the very silence they once used as power starts echoing back at them like loss. Stay with me, because this gets deeper. What looks like peace on the outside can become chaos on the inside. Not because love was weak, but because someone finally stopped carrying two hearts at the same time. And when that happens, the person who thought distance kept them safe often comes face to face with the one thing they spent years trying not to feel, themselves. In so many connections, one person feels deeply and reaches with an open heart, while the other survives by stepping back whenever things get too close. At first, this can feel strangely balanced. One brings warmth, one brings space. One speaks, one stays quiet. One tries to understand, the other tries not to feel too much. For a little while, it almost seems like these two pieces fit. But over time, the pattern starts to hurt. The loving person keeps giving more patience, more understanding, more emotional effort. The distant person keeps taking space, hiding behind silence, and telling themselves they just need room to breathe. What they often do not notice is this. The relationship is not being held together by distance. It is being held together by the person who keeps returning with love. That steady heart becomes the cushion, the bridge, the emotional oxygen in the room. And the second that giving heart grows tired and goes quiet, the hidden imbalance is exposed. This is where everything begins to change. Not in one big dramatic moment, not with shouting, not with revenge. It starts in a still, heavy silence that says, I cannot carry this alone anymore. And if you have ever lived this, then you already know how loud that quiet can be. The distant person often believes they are managing the relationship by staying guarded. But what they are really managing is avoidance of emotion. They are not leading the bond. They are escaping the discomfort inside themselves. And the reason they can do that for so long is because someone else keeps absorbing the impact. Someone else keeps softening the cold edges. Someone else keeps making room for their fear, their confusion, their mixed signals, their shutdowns, and their long disappearances. The loving person does not just offer affection, they offer emotional structure. They calm the storms nobody else sees. They forgive delays. They read between the lines. They hold hope together with both hands. That becomes normal to the distant person. They start assuming that no matter how often they pull away, the connection will still be there. They begin to mistake loyalty for permanence. They confuse patience with endless supply. And this is why the silence shocks them later, because they never imagined the source of warmth would stop flowing. They thought there would always be another message, another chance, another opening, another soft return. But when that stops, the emptiness they kept covered with borrowed comfort starts rising fast. Watch closely here, because this is where the mask begins to slip. At first, they may barely react. They tell themselves the quiet is temporary, just a pause, just a mood, just a little distance before things go back to normal. They expect the familiar cycle to restart. They wait for the reach out, the check-in, the emotional repair. But the quiet continues. And that is when a strange instability begins to move through them. It is subtle in the beginning. A restless feeling, an urge to check, a sudden heaviness at night, a thought they cannot shake. The connection that once seemed guaranteed now feels uncertain. The inner system they kept regulated through someone else's love starts failing in small private ways. They cannot settle the same. Distractions feel weaker. Silence feels different now, not chosen, not protective, unanswered. And that is what makes it sharp. For the first time, they are not the one controlling the distance. For the first time, they are standing inside the same kind of uncertainty they quietly handed to somebody else again and again. And the mind does not like that. The heart likes it even less. This is where emotional collapse often starts, quietly, invisibly. Behind a composed face and a normal routine, a person begins feeling the full weight of what their detachment was costing all along. Many emotionally distant people build their identity around one belief: if I stay guarded, I stay safe. If I pull back, I stay in control. If I do not need too much, I cannot be hurt too much. That belief can feel strong. It can look strong too. But strength built only on shutting down is brittle. It works only while someone else keeps supplying warmth to the bond. When that warmth disappears, distance stops feeling like power and starts feeling like isolation. The same silence that once gave relief now feels like a closed room with no air moving through it. The loving person's patience is no longer softening the coldness. Their care is no longer filling in the emotional gaps. Their reassurance is no longer calming the fear in the background. And now the distant person is left with everything they kept pushing down. Insecurity, fear of closeness, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough, fear of being fully seen, fear of needing someone and then losing them. These feelings do not knock politely. They rise hard. And because they were delayed for so long, they often arrive all at once. That is why the unraveling can feel confusing to them. They thought they were escaping pain. What they were really doing was postponing it. And postponed pain always returns with interest. This part matters more than people admit. Silence is especially painful for someone who has used silence as a shield for years. For them, quiet was never just quiet. It was a hiding place, a way to calm panic without naming it, a way to avoid difficult conversations, deep vulnerability, and emotional exposure. Silence let them delay. Silence let them disappear inside themselves. Silence let them keep love close enough to feel wanted, but far enough to avoid surrender. And because the loving person kept filling that silence with understanding, it looked like a successful strategy. The bond survived, so the silence must have been fine. The other person kept trying, so the distance must not have hurt that much. But then something changes that they never see coming. The loving person becomes quiet too. Not out of cruelty, not to teach a lesson, not to play games. Out of exhaustion, out of truth. Out of reaching that point where the soul says, I cannot keep speaking into a wall and calling it connection. And that kind of silence lands differently. It does not beg. It does not explain itself 10 more times. It does not demand anything. It simply withdraws its energy. And in that moment, the distant person learns something devastating. Their silence was never strength by itself. It only looked strong because somebody loving kept answering it with grace. When the loving person stops chasing, a whole false system breaks. The distant person was often more attached to the pursuit than they understood. Not always on the surface, not in a way they would admit out loud, but deep down being pursued gave them emotional proof that they mattered. It let them feel chosen without having to fully show up. It gave them reassurance without full vulnerability. It kept their fear quiet for one more day. So when the pursuit ends, it does more than create space. It cracks the ego. Because arguments can still feel like connection. Tears can still feel like attachment. Repeated explanations can still feel like investment. But peace is terrifying when you are counting on someone never leaving emotionally. Peace says the other person has accepted what you could not give. Peace says they are no longer trying to rescue the bond by themselves. Peace says the door did not slam. It simply closed with dignity. And that is harder to fight with, harder to deny, harder to twist into another temporary phase. The distant person begins to feel something raw here. Not just loss, but replacement of illusion with truth. They were not as in control as they believed. Their power was borrowed from someone else's patience. Once that patience is gone, all that is left is the echo. And now they are pushed into the one place they have spent years avoiding, their own inner world. This is the battlefield they never wanted to enter. Because looking inward means meeting the younger fears underneath the polished adult distance. It means seeing the old wounds that taught them closeness was risky, tenderness was unstable, and vulnerability might lead to pain. It means admitting that running was never just about needing space. Sometimes it was about not knowing how to stay. Not knowing how to receive love without suspecting it. Not knowing how to trust softness when life once taught them to brace for impact. As long as the loving person kept talking, forgiving, explaining, and reaching back in, there was always noise to hide behind. But silence removes the cover. No one is filling the room now. No one is translating their behavior into something gentler. No one is making excuses on their behalf. And once that buffer disappears, the truth starts pressing in from every side. Suddenly, the pain they caused becomes easier to see. Suddenly, the moments they avoided look different. Suddenly, The one who loved them seems clearer in memory than they ever looked in real time. That delayed clarity can be brutal, because now there is insight, but no guarantee of access. This is why the collapse is usually not loud. It is rarely theatrical. It does not always look like dramatic messages or public regret. Often, it is internal. It shows up late at night, early in the morning, in quiet drives, in random memories during ordinary days. They start replaying moments they once brushed off. The thoughtful message they answered with one dry line, the deep conversation they escaped, the affection they made feel inconvenient, the reassurance they accepted but never returned, the soft chance to open that they let pass again and again. Memory changes under loss. What once looked ordinary now looks precious. What once felt like pressure now feels like care. What once seemed available forever now feels painfully rare. And with that comes regret. Real regret. Not just missing the person, but seeing the pattern, seeing how fear kept interrupting love, seeing how distance kept winning over honesty, seeing how they slowly trained the other person to stop reaching. This is the part nobody tells them when they are still convinced they can always come back later. Later is a dangerous fantasy. Love can be deep and still become tired. A good heart can be loyal and still reach its limit. Once peace replaces pursuit, the old cycle no longer has a place to return to. Something else begins to happen in that silence. The stories they used to protect themselves start falling apart. They can no longer say nobody ever truly cared. They can no longer pretend the bond meant little. They can no longer reduce the other person to being too emotional, too demanding, too sensitive when the quiet now contains no pressure at all. There is nothing left to fight against, no drama to point at, no flood of emotion to call overwhelming, just absence, just space, just the cold truth that someone loved them deeply, tried repeatedly, and finally stopped because they could not survive the imbalance anymore. That truth is hard to escape. It exposes how much they depended on the other person's emotional labor. It reveals that their independence was not as complete as they imagined. In many cases, they were leaning on love while pretending not to need it, leaning on patience while calling it too much, leaning on loyalty while giving just enough to keep the bond breathing. And once that support disappears, they feel the drop. They feel how much of the connection was being carried for them. This does not make them monsters. It makes them unhealed. But unhealed patterns still cause real damage. And when the consequences finally become undeniable, even the strongest defenses begin to crack. The painful part is that many distant people do crave love deeply. They crave safety, steadiness, and a bond that feels real. But they do not always trust what they crave. They want closeness, then panic when it arrives. They want understanding, then withdraw when they feel seen too clearly. They want a safe connection, but when it asks them to stay open, they retreat to old habits. So, when the loving person finally leaves the emotional battlefield and chooses peace, the distant person is left with a terrible realization. The very thing they secretly wanted was right in front of them, and fear kept making them turn away from it. This is why the silence hurts more than conflict. Conflict can still be managed, delayed, argued with, or blamed on the moment. Silence is harder. Silence sits still and lets truth speak. Silence says, this is what remains after all excuses are gone. This is what your pattern built. This is what fear cost. And if the distant person has even a small amount of self-awareness, that truth can shake them to the core, because now they must face not just losing someone, but losing someone they were actually safe with. Someone who might have stayed through their storms if they had only learned how to stop running from the rain. The loving person's silence also changes the emotional mirror completely. Before, the distant person could see themselves through someone else's forgiveness. That soft lens made everything easier to rationalize. A harsh withdrawal became needing space. A cold reply became stress. Emotional neglect became confusion. Mixed signals became complexity. But silence removes the soft filter. Now they begin to see the impact as it really was. The unanswered warmth, the blocked closeness, the repeated shutdowns, the subtle wounds created over time. And this is where shame can enter. Not healthy guilt that leads to growth, but that heavy inner collapse that whispers, I had something real and did not know how to hold it. If they are emotionally immature, they may still run from this feeling. They may distract themselves, chase noise, jump into another connection, or pretend they are fine. But the deeper truth usually waits for them anyway, because unresolved pain has a long memory. So does genuine love. And once they have felt the absence of someone who truly saw them, shallow substitutes rarely bring peace. They may try to recreate the same comfort elsewhere, but what they miss is not just attention. It is the rare feeling of being loved with patience, gentleness, and depth. That kind of loss does not disappear just because they avoid naming it. And here is the twist that cuts the deepest. The collapse is not only about losing the loving person, it is about losing denial. As long as the cycle continued, they could keep believing their distance was protective, necessary, maybe even wise. But when the other person becomes still, when the pursuit ends, when the warmth is no longer there to keep the emotional machine running, denial has nowhere left to hide. They begin to see that their pattern did not protect love. It slowly drained it. Their silence did not preserve the bond. It weakened it. Their emotional shutdowns did not save them from heartbreak. They built the heartbreak piece by piece. And once that understanding fully lands, it changes the whole story inside their mind. Suddenly, the problem was not that love asked too much. The problem was that fear kept rejecting what love needed to survive. This realization can feel like an internal earthquake. Because now the person must admit that intimacy was not the enemy. Vulnerability was not the trap. Being cared for was not the threat. The real threat was the old wound inside them that taught them to flee from what could have healed them. If you have ever been on the receiving end of that pattern, you know how painful this truth is. And if you have ever been the one doing the running, you know how long it can take to face it honestly. Still, this is not only a story about pain. It is also a story about what silence finally reveals. The loving person's quiet is not weakness. It is not failure. It is often the moment they stop abandoning themselves in order to keep someone else comfortable. It is the moment they choose self-respect over endless explanation. It is the moment they understand that love should not require self-erasure. And that shift matters because when they stop filling every empty space with effort, they begin to reclaim their own energy. They see how much they were over-functioning. They see how often they were translating, soothing, waiting, hoping, and carrying. Their silence becomes clean, grounded, strong. It says, I love deeply, but I will not disappear trying to prove that love one more time. And that kind of silence has power. Not the power of revenge, the power of truth, the power of emotional adulthood, the power of finally stepping out of a cycle that rewarded distance and drained devotion. This is why the quiet can feel so final to the one who ran. It is no longer emotional noise they can wait out. It is clarity, and clarity is hard to negotiate with once it arrives. So, when the distant person starts unraveling after the loving person goes silent, it is not magic. It is not sudden punishment. It is consequence meeting awareness. It is the nervous system feeling what it delayed. It is the heart realizing what the ego minimized. It is memory lighting up all the moments that were wasted. It is loneliness becoming impossible to dress up as freedom. It is the recognition that being wanted by someone real was never a small thing. And for the loving person, this matters too, because their silence is not evidence that they did not care enough. It is often evidence that they cared until caring alone became unbearable. The quiet did not destroy the bond by itself. The quiet revealed what the bond had become. That is why it hits so hard. It strips away fantasy. It shows who was holding the connection up, who kept avoiding the work, and what happens when one heart refuses to keep bleeding just to keep the story alive. And if there is one truth worth holding on to, it is this. Real love does not fail because one person feels too deeply. Real love fails when fear keeps refusing the very closeness it claims to want. In the end, the silence becomes a teacher for both people. For the one who loved, it teaches that peace is not the same as giving up. Sometimes, peace is what love looks like when it finally stops begging to be met. For the one who ran, it teaches that distance can feel safe for a while, but it cannot build the connection the soul secretly longs for. Sooner or later, every avoided feeling waits at the door. Every postponed truth returns. Every unlived moment of tenderness becomes a memory with edges. And that is why the quiet becomes unforgettable, because in that quiet, both people finally see clearly. One sees that they must never carry love alone again. The other sees that fear cost them more than vulnerability ever would have. And once that truth settles in, nothing feels casual anymore. Not the missed chances, not the unanswered warmth, not the person who once stood there with open hands and a patient heart. The silence says what words could not. It says the chase is over. The illusion is over. The borrowed comfort is over. Now there is only truth, and truth, even when it hurts, is where real change finally begins.